Hello, YouTube. My name is Stefan. I go by Murmurs Online, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Very much looking forward to having you here and hopefully getting to grow this community out a little bit more. This channel is going to be dedicated pretty much exclusively to Dimir Shadow, a deck that I've now been piloting pretty much exclusively for a year. However, I have been playing Modern and really Magic the Gathering now since Kaladesh, but for whatever reason, Dimir Shadow really spoke to me in terms of its play style and really the position it has within the meta as a whole over the last year or so. I really feel like it's been a great deck, and it's treated me exceptionally well. I don't really get an opportunity to get into or register into these larger events. My weekends typically are going to be taken up with other things, but the few times that I have had a chance to get into larger events, I've been able to do quite well with it. And in my other free time on weekdays, I do get opportunities to enter leagues online, and I've been able to keep a 75 to 80% win rate over quite a while now. So yeah, just looking forward to hopefully being able to give you some better perspective on how I play my particular list, and really just the intricacies of my play style. And hopefully it will help you become a little bit better with the deck. So looking forward to being able to create a community and continue a discussion over time. I've decided to put a pop-up on the right of the deck list with kind of a sideboard, and that will of course change with every league that we go through if the deck is going to change at all. But my core 60 has pretty much stayed the same for the last several months, just with a few minor changes to adding a Fatal Push here or an extra Orcish Bowmaster. Really, the deck has stayed quite consistent. It's been the sideboard, and even that has stayed quite consistent, but it has changed, here and there. So you'll see a couple different testings of different things depending on what I'm anticipating in either a league or potential tournament if I do get the opportunity to get into that. But I think I'll make another video dedicated specifically to the reasons I choose the cards that I do and how I've continued to build out the deck over time. No need to dive too much into that moving forward. But without any further ado, I think we can get into the first game of this league and take it from there. So yeah, this is the opening hand that we start with. We are going to be playing on the draw. No idea what we're up against, and this is obviously complete garbage. No lands, nothing to really work with, so we're going to ship it. What we end up getting is definitely much more functional. I wouldn't say it's exceptional, but we're going to keep it. We're going to throw back the Tishana's Tidebinder. At the end of the day, it's not going to probably be all that relevant, at least not on the draw. In this current situation, I'd much rather have looks at some other more relevant cards and have access to more mana. There's always the opportunity to shuffle the Tishana's Tidebinder back somewhere to the top of the deck with the Flooded Strand. So we'll see how it plays out. All right, Caverns of Souls on humans. Haven't played humans in quite a while, but at the end of the day, definitely a more difficult matchup. To be very cautious about how we play with our life total, and that's the reason why I'm fetching an island here and not shocking in a Watery Grave. Unfortunately, we do find a Death Shadow, so the leniency with our life total maybe would have been a little bit better, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. I'd still rather play a little bit more conservatively in case I do get overwhelmed on the board. Of course, having a Stubborn Denial and a Counterspell in hand up against a Cavern of Souls is really not going to be all that great for me moving forward. They seem to be stuck on land here, but they do get out a Copper Coat, which continues to cause some problems. I'm going to draw a Death Shadow, or excuse me, a Dress Down for turn. And in this instance, I do want to be able to basically play this out at my end step to be able to turn off the mana generation that they have and also reduce some of the life, or I guess the damage they're going to be putting towards my life total. I do want to, of course, be able to get my Death Shadow, but at the end of the day, this just feels like the best play under the circumstances. Unfortunately, we continue to draw pretty much completely irrelevant cards for the matchup. Counterspell, Counterspell. It's just not going to be good enough. And as this game continues to play out, there's just no opportunity for me to really get a win against a bunch of uncounterable humans. Okay, on to game two, hopefully with a better result. Take a quick glance at sideboarding here. I've got 4 counterspells coming out, as well as 2 Stubborn Denials. I'm going to be putting in 2 Engineered Explosives, 1 Surgical Extraction, a Dress Down, and 2 Stern Scoldings. Realistically, Counterspell and Stubborn Denial, just terrible cards to have in this matchup. Some of the cards I'm bringing in, also not maybe that great, but definitely better than the options that I had. EE is just a good option. dress down, typically going to be okay in the matchup. Surgical and Stern Scoldings, maybe they end up being relevant, but they're definitely better than Stubborn Denial or Counter Spells just completely getting stranded in hand. And Stern Scolding is basically just a 1-mana counterspell in this matchup, unless, of course, they hit a bunch of Caverns of Souls and we just doesn't matter anyway. So that's our sideboard. In terms of our opening hand here, on the play, it's a little bit risky, but I do think there's a pretty good opportunity to be proactive enough with a Death Shadow in hand, Thoughtseize, fetch land, as well as a Surgical Extraction. If I do hit a fetch land or even a shock off the top, I will be able to get out a turn 2 Death Shadow. Maybe not ideal in terms of the way that I have to do it, but it could be a very quick clock moving forward that will allow me to do some pretty relevant things as the game progresses. So we're going to run it and see what we have. Going to, of course, lead on a Thoughtseize, and this Thoughtseize will show us a pretty stacked hand. I mean, realistically, humans, from what I've been seeing, I haven't played against it in quite a while, but now with the Fury ban, it's been pretty prevalent, I think. I think there's been a lot of people looking to play the deck, get their hands on it again, as it's always been good up until the printing of Fury. But yeah, so taking a look at the hand, we see Chalice of the Void, which is terrible, Mantis Rider, and a Mirran Crusader. That is also going to be pretty rough for us if we're not able to deal with it. No Cavern of Souls in opponent's hands, so that's nice. As much as I'd like to take the Mirran Crusader here, I do feel like I just have to take the Chalice because we still have quite a few 1-mana spells, and being turned off of the potential ability to play the Death Shadow out would just be pretty backbreaking. So we're going to take the Chalice here and hopefully see how that goes for us. Opponent is going to play out the Noble Hierarch, which realistically we are able to Fatal Push and then get a Shadow out. Now, I do consider taking a look at holding off on the Surgical Extraction, as realistically it's kind of going to impact my ability to drown future spells. And I do know that there's a Mirran Crusader in their hand, so being able to potentially drown the Mirran Crusader, while probably still not going to happen because of the fact that they don't really run fetch lands and there's not really going to be many other cards hitting their graveyard, there is a give and a take there. But being able to both remove the problem card of Chalice of the Void, as well as lowering my life total to be able to present more of a clock, just feels like the better play. It also gives me a little bit more information around what their draw is for the last 2 turns. And we do see that we've got a Coppercoat Vanguard and another land to be dealing with. So as of right now, feeling generally okay. We'll see how that Mirran Crusader continues to play out over time, but generally feeling pretty good about where we're at. They play out the Coppercoat and not too concerned about it. In this instance, I am going to swing into the Coppercoat, kind of hoping that they actually just block. Basically, if they do block, I do have Drown Up for the Mirran Crusader. If they don't block, well, that's perfectly fine. I'll get the 3 in. There is an argument to casting a Bitter Triumph, paying the 3 life, and doing 6 damage to my opponent, but that kind of feels like I'm putting myself pretty dead to a Mirran Crusader should it resolve. So it just feels better to play patiently and take it from there. So my opponent, of course, does hit their Cavern of Souls. At this point, Drown the Lock, completely irrelevant for stack interaction. We now just have to be able to play on the battlefield and remove what makes the most sense under the circumstances. In this case, going to my end step, I do Triumph the Coppercoat Vanguard, basically just a way to start lowering my life total a little bit, feeling or putting a bit of pressure onto my opponent, while still being able to hold up some interaction for anything that might hit the field on the next turn. I do have an Orcish Bowmaster to at least help try and block something that might come out, but really feeling pretty behind at this point with the Crusader hitting the board and no way to relevantly interact with it. Opponent is going to cast their Mantis Rider. In this instance, they do swing in. They choose not to swing with the Mirran Crusader, which to me is a little weird. I think I'm dead in 2 turns if they swing with it. I'm technically just dead on board if I don't have an answer to the Mantis Rider. So bit of a weird one. They're not dead on the crackback. Not really sure why they made this decision. Although I guess maybe, I think in theory, they would be dead to something really weird. I really don't know what they were playing around there. Lucky to hit a Death Shadow as my draw. This allows me to start being a little bit more aggressive and kind of take at least some type of line that will help me get the win. They play out Adeline, so now have to be cautious about how I play this out. I do have a fetch land. We do still have 4 fatal pushes in the deck. To hit Revolt, of course, we need that fetch land to still be there. So I do not want to fetch in my end step to try and thin the deck. I do want to try and potentially hit a fatal push off the top so that I can get rid of the Adeline and start applying pressure with swinging in with both shadows. And what do you know? Get extremely lucky and hit the exact fatal push that I was hoping to find. Push the Adeline, swing in for 14 technically, but they're going to just block 7 of it. However, they are now dead on board. Should they not have anything too crazy, and they don't, we are able to Orcish Bowmaster ping down the Avacyn's Pilgrim and swing for, well, would have swung for lethal on the crackback, but opponent concedes. So we'll move on to game number 3. And we are back for game number 3. No changes to sideboards, just kind of want to keep everything as is. There's really nothing that needs to be changing. Felt pretty good about how I had it going into game number 2, and being on the draw doesn't really change how I want to play the matchup as a whole. Opponent is going to keep 7. My opening hand, again, kind of iffy, but it does have a Thoughtseize and a Preordain, plus multiple kill spells once I've hit my second land. It's kind of an easier keep in my mind against humans specifically while we're on the draw, especially when they've shown me that they have Chalice of the Void, and Thoughtseize on turn 1 is really the only good answer that I have to a turn 2 Chalice in the matchup, given that I've taken out my 1-mana counter spells for it. So it's really kind of just hope that we hit the second land and see how it plays out. So my opponent here, of course, finds another Cavern of Souls, but does nothing else. I'm going to Thoughtseize and see what we find. Unfortunately, again, up against another pretty stacked hand. They've got Adeline, Auriok Champion, Mantis Rider, Unsettled Mariner, and a Mirran Crusader. However, they only have 1 land. So they're going to potentially be stuck on 2 lands, and all of their spells, other than the Mariner and the Champion, cost 3 mana. So there's really only a couple of cards that I'm really scared of at this point. Finding Auriok Champion to be kind of the worst of the options currently at play. Auriok Champion not only has protection from all of my black creatures, but also allows them to slowly gain life over the course of the game. And if I do end up in a situation where I needed to swing in for 1 or 2 total points of damage over the game, and I didn't get that because their life gain, I can probably point back to Auriok Champion being the take in that case, right? So I do take Auriok Champion here, leaving them still with a pretty scary hand, but we'll see how I'm able to hopefully maneuver that as time goes on. They're going to play out their Unsettled Mariner, and I'm going to basically just kind of hold off for now and see how things play out. They do get stuck on a land here, however, they do find a Pilgrim. I'm going to fetch at end of turn and go find myself an island. Again, really want to be somewhat conservative with my life total, while also being able to play out an Orcish Bowmaster. I do feel like I need something on board to help protect me from any attacks they might try and make, as well as just be somewhat mana efficient. With this Mariner on the board, if I don't find another land, can't really interact with their creatures anyway with Bowmaster. So I'd rather have some type of blocker to just be on the field and let me do other things with my mana moving forward, depending on how I draw. I do hit the land that I need, and you're going to see here, I unfortunately punt this game very, very badly. I make the right call, swinging in with the army token here, basically allowing them to block with the Mariner, flash in the Orcish Bowmaster, getting rid of the Mariner, and then paying the 1 for the Pilgrim to go down as well on the Bowmaster trigger. However, I really don't know what I was thinking here. I guess I just either didn't read the card or I hadn't thought much about, what Unsettled Mariner does. Maybe I thought it was 2 mana to pay for its counter effect. I really don't know, but basically I'm going to swing in. They don't make the block, and I flash in the Bowmaster like I'm supposed to get rid of the Pilgrim, but instead I ping myself while they're stuck on mana. It's really just a bad play. really shouldn't have happened. And of course, opens them up to being able to cast all of the terrible cards that I was scared about when I saw them in the opening Thoughtseize. So of course, they're going to play out the Mirror Crusader. And really from here, my only hope is being able to land a Murktide Regent and hope that it sticks. I do go for a Fatal Push now against the Mariner to be able to fill my graveyard with a little bit of extra stuff to increase the size of this Murktide Regent. It will be at least a relevant blocker against the Mirror Crusader. If they want to try and do something about it, then so be it. Unfortunately for me, they do find a Reflector Mage in the last 2 draws, and at this point, I mean, this game is just completely out of hand. Really kind of coming back to a terrible, terrible punt by, I think, just not reading the cards or completely forgetting how Unsettled Mariner worked. I really just had the opportunity to take advantage of that game and potentially win. Not saying that I would have won, but certainly would have been in a much better position had I not completely punted that one particular line. So really unfortunate to start the league off with a loss, but I mean, haven't seen humans in a long time. Not an excuse, but definitely kind of disappointing to look back on these games and see how poorly I played this third one. Okay, and we're back for match number 2. Opponent's going to be on the play. My opening hand in this instance, kind of 50-50, but I do feel that being on the draw allows me to likely hit the second land drop that I need just with my natural draw. Even if I don't, I do have a Preordain that is likely to find me the second land. And once I have 2 lands, I've got pretty relevant stack interaction, as well as the ability to interact with pretty much any creature that might hit the battlefield. And over time, as this game is going to play out, be able to hopefully get a pretty large Murktide or a relevant Tishana play in. So feeling pretty okay about this one, and we'll see how it plays out. Opponent is going to start with the Gardens as into a Amulet of Vigor. Amulet Titan, I think, is a pretty 50-50 matchup in my experience playing against it. Certainly need to have a subset of relevant cards come off the top of my deck, and just hope that they're not powering through on turn 3, sometimes 2. I don't even know if most decks these days are capable of putting out turn 2 Titans in their construction. But nonetheless, as long as they're not trying to power it out too quickly, where you can disrupt them effectively, it's going to be a pretty 50-50 matchup, if not potentially a little bit more in our favor. So I'm going to lead on a Preordain. I did find my second land off of my draw. Fantastic. And I do see probably 2 of the better cards that I could want in this matchup, well, at least in my current situation, which is another fetch land as well as a Dress Down. Dress Down is able to turn off your Titan triggers and really most relevant things that Titan is trying to do. And the third fetch land will allow us to enable Tishana's Tidebinder in a few turns, which will definitely also be very relevant. So we're going to top both of those and see how the game progresses. My opponent is going to go for creating another Amulet of Vigor and bouncing, their land back to their hand and just kind of leaving an empty board other than some artifacts. Honestly, this is great for me. Just signals that I'm going to be able to pretty much counter anything that is going to hit or at least try and hit the battlefield, because they're unlikely to have Cavern of Souls available to them with the mana that they're trying to generate off of their bounce lands. So going to click through here a bit, and they go to try and put a Dryad on the stack. Of course, definitely going to take the opportunity to counterspell this and move on to being able to start playing either with Tishana's Tidebinder next turn, or continuing to counter any relevant spells that try to go onto the stack. Hitting a second Murktide Regent, not really that great of a draw, kind of going to end up probably being pretty irrelevant as my graveyard is unlikely to get big enough. My opponent plays out a Teleria West, and I know that I can start to apply a little bit more pressure by playing out the Tidebinder and stifling one of the amulet triggers. This will turn off one of their amulets and forcing them or not allowing them to actually crack the expedition map, because they will lose one of those untaps. So it essentially just negates the turn they're trying to play, allowing me to also put some pressure down and turn off one of their Amulet of Vigor. So all in all, I think pretty straightforward play there. Able to draw another fetch land for turn, which is great. And I am going to start looking to apply more pressure with being able to hold up Counterspell and get out a 5/5 Murktide Regent. Of course, not going to end up being the biggest Murktide Regent, but definitely a substantial clock should I be able to keep their board clear moving forward. They are going to play a third Amulet of Vigor and kind of start to go all in on, like I was talking about before, just generating large amounts of mana off of one land and hoping to just jam it through. In this case, they are going to put a Summoner's Pact onto the stack. I'm actually okay with letting that resolve because they're just going to be dead to that Summoner's Pact trigger on their upkeep, and I'm able to knowingly counter anything that goes onto the stack, likely to be a Dryad Arbor, or excuse me, a Dryad of the Elysian Grove, because they need to essentially be playing another land to even generate further mana and start to try and do your typical Amulet Titan shenanigans. So that's exactly what ends up happening here. They do go for the Dryad. I counter. They concede. Pretty straightforward win. Anytime that your Amulet Titan opponent is really forcing through the one land hands, a lot of opportunities to really sit on those counter spells and use them as effectively as possible, and really try and kind of play around the interactions with Summoner's Pact as effectively as possible. Here we are in game number 2. Take a quick look at sideboarding first and foremost. I think a lot of people, at least some people in the Shadow Cabal Discord, have asked how I play this matchup, especially with some of the sideboard options that I have to me. I do bring in Chalice of the Void. As you'll see in my opening hand here, I think it's a phenomenal card to have to disrupt just really their Summoner Pact lines and can really set them back quite a ways. Of course, they do have ways of dealing with a Chalice of the Void, but it can be a substantial setback depending on what type of hand they keep. So anyway, looking at the cuts and the adds, we're going to take out 2 counter spells. I mean, at the end of the day, they do have Cavern of Souls available to them, and then 2 stubs. There's not a lot of things in the deck that you're going to look to counter, and if you're bringing in the Chalice of the Voids, then 1 of or 4 of those spells that you would potentially counter with a Stubborn Denial are already going to be likely taken and counted for with Chalice. And then also taking out 3 pushes. I mean, not, again, usually going to be a super relevant spell other than being able to push a Hate Dryad of the Elysian Grove. So keeping 1 in the deck, still nice to have, but certainly going to potentially be a liability in multiples. And then adding EE, definitely want to have those for basically just the lines where they might go for constructs with Urza Sagas, or of course, the more relevant thing is being able to put it on 1 and blow up a board of amulets. And then adding Surgical Extraction here. Surgical, kind of a card I was randomly playing with for this league, maybe the course of 2 leagues, just to kind of get a sense of how it could potentially disrupt certain decks. At the end of the day, in this matchup, definitely a better matchup to have access to this card, being able to just surgically extract their most relevant things to kind of combo off. Really going to be nice. Now, of course, not always possible, but definitely wanted to see what I could do with it. And then adding the 3rd Dress Down, also going to be just very relevant, as Dress Down is a phenomenal spell in this matchup. So that's the situation there. And our opening hand, as we can see, quite strong. It does have a Chalice of the Void, so really hoping that we're able to catch our opponent on a hand where they're going a little bit in on the Summoner's Pacts. And we also have a Thoughtseize preordained to kind of dig deeper into the deck while also disrupting anything that our opponent is trying to do. Having 2 Death Shadows available to me over time while still being able to lower my life total quite quickly at this point is also just exceptional, right? So very happy with this hand and ready to see just how well it will do. Opponent is on 7 again. They are going to lead with the Boseiju and another Amulet of Vigor, so definitely have the potential to push out some pretty strong hands. Going to lead on a Thoughtseize first and not put out the Chalice. So always good to be sequencing in such a way in case they are playing Force of Vigor, basically potentially just allowing yourself to, I mean, yes, it might be a 3 for 1 or whatever it ends up being. If they do go for a Force of Vigor into a Thoughtseize, but it still just feels better to be sequencing in this way. Our Thoughtseize is going to reveal 2 Summoners Pacts. Fantastic. So happy that I've got Chalice of the Void available to me. A Defense Grid and a One Ring, as well as a Bounce Land. So in this instance, definitely want to be taking the Defense Grid. Really want to continue to be able to interact with my opponent on their turn and have stack interaction available to me, so counterspell, stuff like that. And really, we've kind of just shut down most of their hand moving forward, at least for a period of time. They do have the option to bounce the Boseiju back to their hand and blow up the Chalice of the Void if they want, but it will continue to slow them down significantly. And it's really just maybe not the best play for them. As we can see, they're choosing not to do that at all. So I'm assuming they might have other types of interaction for this Chalice of the Void. or they've just accepted that they need to continue to play a slower game to figure out how to get to where they need to be to win this. Now, moving forward for me onto my turn 3, I have not hit my third land, but I am going to put 2 Death Shadows into play and start trying to pressure my opponent. They are going to play out another Amulet of Vigor and get out their One Ring that I've known about since the start of the game. Honestly, not super concerned with this. We've got access to an Orcish Bowmaster, which is capable of putting in work, and we still have at least a couple of somewhat relevant counter spells, but Drown in the Loch, not going to hit a tremendous amount of spells against Amulet Titan. They do go for a Force of Vigor in my end step, pitching an Arboreal Grazer, so it does show why they weren't trying to bounce their Boseiju and get rid of the Chalice of the Void earlier. I mean, it also, again, puts them into a position, if they do that anyway, that they're going to kind of be trying to force through large amounts of mana with one singular land, which is advantageous to us, as we saw in game 1. So I think just a lot of reasons for them not to do it, but to see them have to kind of pitch a card to blow it up, again, just phenomenal stuff, and a reason why you should always be playing Chalice of the Voids in this matchup if it is in your sideboard. So I'll stop here just quickly to talk about the One Ring activation. Always opportunities to flash in Orcish Bowmasters and kind of just try and force damage onto my opponent as much as possible. But I do want to be able to interact with whatever it is that they might be putting on the stack. Like I said earlier, Drown in the Loch isn't going to hit much, but because they've cast a Force of Vigor, they do now have 3 spells in their graveyard, and I'm assuming they're trying to at least push through a Dryad of the Elysian Grove. So I do want to be able to interact with it on the stack so that they're not able to drop another land and start to pile up just excessive amounts of mana. So again, just a pretty heads up play here that I feel really helps close this game out for me. And at this point, my opponent is a little bit stuck. They do have access to a lot of draws, but it's just likely going to be not good enough unless they're able to find a very significant combo of cards to kind of come out of it. Again, they are going to go for an activation with the One Ring, and as tempting as it is to power out an Orcish Bowmaster and do an extra 3 damage, 4 damage really with the ping, they're already dead on board with what I have out there with my 2 shadows, both 4/4 that can be increased if needed with the Bowmaster at end step. So I do want to try and be able to interact with whatever they're going to put on the stack again. And in this case, they only have access to 5 mana, so they can't get a Titan onto the battlefields, which means that they have to kind of play out some combo of cards again to try and increase that mana over time, or just play out a One Ring like they have here. And luckily that's exactly 4 mana, so we can interact with it again, and they scoop it up. So in this case, really just wanted to show how patience and knowing what you're trying to interact with to get a win is really going to help get you there. As much as Orcish Bowmaster is a great card against the One Ring, the likelihood of me having just died to being maybe either a bit greedy or a bit too loose with casting Orcish Bowmaster is much higher than just being able to play patiently and interact with the relevant spells that are going to get my opponent out of the bind. So another good win here. I'm very happy with how I played this one, and I think there's some good information here that can be used for anyone looking to improve with the deck, just from the sideboarding plan having been very relevant in this matchup, to also just kind of trusting the deck to draw either more interaction or lands over time. It's really just something that you need to learn to be able to do, is more often than not trust that the deck will find other lands or just relevant things for you to interact effectively with your opponent based on what they're trying to do. On to match number 3. Opening hand is definitely quite strong, especially being on the play. The opportunity to lead on the Thoughtseize, and then on turn 2, either hold up Orcish Bowmasters or preordain with Fatal Push and Stubborn Denial up, depending on the matchup. Definitely a strong opener for the deck. I'm very happy to see it being on the play. Going to lead on the Thoughtseize, and that's going to reveal a pretty rough matchup that's extremely prevalent right now, I guess, in the meta, which is Yawgmoth. I mean, probably one of the worst matchups the deck has. They can just grind so much, especially with the new edition of Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So Not a great matchup, but we see that they're kind of going in on a hand that really relies on either the halfling to generate future mana or just trying to hit a lot of lands successively. So in this case, I do think I get a little tunnel visioned and choose the halfling, forgetting that I have a fatal push to answer it next turn anyway. Nonetheless, my strategy when seeing this hand was to stop them from having mana sources as much as possible, and a young wolf by itself really isn't that much of a threat, especially when we have a bowmaster to ping it down and then block it in the future anyway. I do think that the better take here is probably still the wolf than pushing the halfling on my turn 2 and holding up a stub for the cauldron should they find the second land. At the end of the day, that's not the line I take. And like I said, I think I got a little bit tunnel visioned. I know that's a tendency that I can have from time to time, especially if I've been playing more heavily or just really trying to grind through a couple of leagues. So maybe not the best play, but nonetheless, I think it's still going to be just fine so long as things don't get too out of hand. Opponent is going to lead on the young wolf, and we're just going to hold up the Orcish Bowmaster. We do see that my opponent is not hitting their land drop. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't choose to attack first and then cast the Delighted Halfling. As you'll see, I'm going to basically ping down this young wolf, knowing that they can't cast the Cauldron that I was concerned about. So I'm able to save some damage as well as deal with, at least to some degree, the young wolf in a way that's meaningful, while still getting some action onto the board to help kind of protect myself into the future. So this really works out for me, and kind of just a missed sequence in my opinion by my opponent. I mean, I would never have cast that Orcish Bowmaster into the young wolf had they just not played the halfling until their second main phase. So this works out in my advantage. I'll continue to try and compound off of some of that as they're stuck on one land. Now, of course, here this is going to be a pretty straightforward play. I want to get that halfling off the board, knowing that they're stuck on mana. And then I'm going to preordain, see what I can do to find just more relevant things. I do need to get a bit more of a clock going here, as Orcish Bowmasters alone probably not going to win this game, especially with just how grindy this matchup can be. I do find a Consider and an Otawara. I am going to keep the Consider. The Otawara not super relevant in this matchup, so I'll shift that down to the bottom. And then I am just going to continue to hold up my Stubborn Denial in anticipation of the Agatha Soul Cauldron that I know is in hand. They continue to not hit their lands. They're going to swing in here, which I'm perfectly okay with taking the 2 damage. I do not want to be throwing away 2 relevant creatures that can help kind of over the span of the rest of the game, and I choose to consider in my end step. Basically, just trying to get deeper to find, like I said, more relevant cards for the matchup. They are still very stuck, but we're not putting all that much pressure on them. Dress Down here is a pretty nice find, as it can kind of turn off different aspects of what my opponent might look to do. They go for another Young Wolf, which lets me fatal push the one that no longer has the Undying. Starting to get a little bit flooded now, but I'm going to swing in here with my Orcish Bowmaster, or excuse me, the token. And this is actually a pretty free attack. If my opponent chooses to block, I am going to do exactly what I did, which is Dress Down, turning off the Undying effect, and wiping away another Young Wolf. I mean, the game continues to go quite a bit longer. Just them having more access to Undying creatures is not great, and being able to keep their board state pretty clear from Court of Callings is also very, very good. So very happy that my opponent made the decision to block here. Unfortunately, we're still getting kind of flooded out, but they haven't been able to do anything for the last couple of turns, and we're finally able to Stubborn Denial that Soul Cauldron that we've been worried about as they found their second land. I hit a great draw in a Murktide Regent, and don't need to be worried about Grist if they were to draw it, because they don't have a way of getting a creature onto the board and being able to -2 the Grist to get the Murktide off the battlefield. So it's very easy to just push forward and kind of see how things go. And yeah, I guess I feel I should stop because they scooped it up. So all in all, pretty happy that I took the approach of just trying to keep them off mana as much as possible, and kind of picking my spots on how to play the matchup and how to play the particular opening hand that I saw from my opponent. I think really helped me get to the win here. Luckily, didn't completely flood out, but definitely could have gotten into a spot where my opponent was able to come back had I not been able to get a little bit deeper into the deck and find that Murktide. All in all, very happy with game 1 win against a very difficult matchup, and we'll see how we can do on game 2. On to game number 2. Quickly pull up the sideboard and give you a sense of some of the changes that I made. Going to be adding 2 Stern Scoldings, 2 Totems, 2 Surgicals, taking out a Dress Down, 2 Stubs, 1 Counterspell, 2 Preordain. The Stern Scoldings, they hit some of the cards that I'm most scared about, Grist and Yawgmoth being the biggest ones, as well as a couple others that can be relevant over time. Now, of course, they can potentially make them uncounterable with the Halfling, but at the end of the day, I think it's a perfectly fine card to be bringing in the matchup, given that it's a 1-mana counterspell for very relevant interaction. Totems, just good at removing activated abilities for all of their creatures. Of course, they will have answers to it, but it's a good enough card to be bringing in. It's really the only reason you would have it in your sideboard is for this matchup in the first place. Surgical Extractions, okay. Not the best card to have, but definitely not the worst. It can take out one of the more relevant creatures if you're able to find it in a graveyard in a pinch, and potentially also stop an Agatha Soul Cauldron activation, depending on the situation. So overall, I'd rather have it in there. Dress Down, happy to take 1 out, as it's not really going to shut down what my opponent's trying to do long term. It can stop them for a turn. It can affect certain things, but it's just not that great of a card in the matchup. If anything, it's just a cycle card that can be somewhat impactful depending on the situation. Taking out 2 Stubs, Stub hit basically hits almost nothing in this matchup beyond Agatha Soul Cauldron and Port of Calling. Both of those, typically they're going to either just have the mana to pay for it, or we just don't have a creature on board to make it ferocious, and it's just a completely irrelevant spell that gets stuck in your hand for the rest of the game. Taking out 1 counter spell, again, they can make their spells, at least the most relevant ones, uncounterable with Halfling, so I don't want to get stuck with stack interaction if I end up in a spot like that, so I think trimming on 1 is perfectly fine. And then Preordain, I don't know how many Bowmasters my opponent might be playing, but I definitely know they're probably on at least 1 or 2. And being in a spot where you have to draw cards at sorcery speed and allow them to start kind of forcing your hand a bit with the triggers, it's just not the place that I want to be. So removing some of the sorcery speed draws is something that I try and prioritize in a matchup like this. So that's the sideboarding. Let's get into the actual gameplay here. Pretty good opening hand, and this matchup is actually going to be a pretty big grind. Part of the reason I wanted to even start this channel in the first place is I think there's a lot of relevant decisions and just interesting gameplay that can help make both myself and others who are playing the deck continuously learn and improve in their gameplay patterns and their line decisioning. So really looking forward to walking through this one with you guys and seeing how it plays out. So opening hand, pretty strong against Yawgmoth on the play. Pretty easy keep that allows me to interact meaningfully with my opponent. If they lead on a Halfling, of course, this hand does lose some value, but that's a risk I'm going to take for the overall strength of what it gives me deeper into the game. So we're going to play it out. Now my opponent, as we'll see, doesn't have that turn 1 Halfling, so I'm quite happy with that. And I'm going to be leading on the Thoughtseize to get a sense of what it is that I'm playing against. And hopefully I'm able to take something juicy and a plan for kind of the next turns accordingly based off of what I see. Thoughtseize is going to show us a Grist, a Bowmaster, and a Wall of Roots. There's an argument to taking the Bowmaster here and leaving the Grist, as they can't play it the next turn anyway, and I do have a backup Thoughtseize to remove it next turn. However, I'm doubting my opponent will main phase cast the Bowmaster, which means that I can scold it, and my other Thoughtseize will allow me to take a more impactful card down the road. And honestly, I'm just not that scared of Bowmasters. Yes, they can start to compound and allow them to more quickly turn on a Court of Calling, but we don't see one here, and it just isn't that scary given some of the other cards that they can draw. So I'm happy to take the Bowmaster, or excuse me, the Grist, leave the Bowmaster, and assume that I'm going to be able to scold it in the coming turns. All right, so unfortunately here, though, my opponent is going to draw a Soul Cauldron, which is probably the best draw that their deck could give them, given the current state of affairs. So this is going to be a pretty big grind, and I'm going to, unfortunately got a little bit carried away here, but I'm going to have to change my game plan a little bit. At this point, I'm no longer going to assume that I can scold the Orcish Bowmaster. I don't really want to have to play at instant speed. I'd rather force kind of more sorcery speed stuff through. So I do want to Thoughtseize the Bowmaster that I know about and leave a Stern Scolding up that is going to allow me to deal with the Wall of Roots that is in their hand and that they're likely to cast, right? Which is exactly what they're going to do here. And I'm going to make sure that that hits the graveyard. Of course, they do have the Soul Cauldron to really continue to compound value and just grind this game out. Luckily, I do have a Tishana's Tidebinder. I do have the third land. So feeling overall pretty good about the situation, given they're on one card. But as you'll soon find out, this game is going to go quite a bit longer. And the reasons why Yawgmoth is just such a rough matchup for us just gets perfectly exemplified as we continue to play this out. Preordain is going to find Fatal Push and a Watery Grave. I am going to, of course, keep the Fatal Push, the Watery Grave, as much as I could use the fourth land. It's not absolutely needed. And I am going to take this time to get down a Murktide Regent. This Murktide is going to be at least somewhat large. You know, a 6/6 Murktide is pretty good. And I know for a fact that my opponent isn't going to be able to. Well, sorry, they technically could have a Grist next turn and a creature if they were to have fetched a Dryad Arbor there. But they would also have to sacrifice that Dryad Arbor to be able to kill my Murktide Regent, and they would have had to have had the Grist as well. So feeling pretty good about getting the Murktide down, and the fact that my opponent has a Soul Cauldron in play kind of makes me need to force it through that much more quickly, as my graveyard will likely slowly be eaten by them. We do see that they have the Grist here. They're, like I said, having to +1 it because they cannot -2 with no creatures in play to remove the Murktide. So in this instance, I'm able to kind of not stress too much. I'll know that I can fly over, deal with the Grist here, and then have some other relevant interaction for what's to come, right? The Tishana's Tidebinder, definitely going to be super relevant. Drawing a second one here is just absolute gravy. And they go for the activation with the Cauldron, which at this point I definitely want to be stifling, as well as giving me the opportunity to turn off their Soul Cauldron. Unfortunately, they've drawn a Court of Calling, which allows them to get another Grist, and they are going to downtick, and instead of taking up the Tidebinder that is turning off their Agatha Soul Cauldron, they see the bigger threat in the dragon, in the Murktide, and I'm able to swing in openly at their Grist to get it off the board, essentially putting them down to what I'm going to assume is one more in deck, with 3 now having been played. So pretty happy with that, as Grist is a pretty problem card for us. It just do so much. In this case, I also want to Fatal Push the token that has a counter on it, as this point they are presenting somewhat of a clock, and I don't want to get into a spot where I'm just dying to a bad beatdown. So leaving them with just a 1/1 is, I think, the better thing to be doing. Of course, they draw another Cauldron, and this allows them to get out of the situation that they were in before. And unfortunately, I didn't stop fast enough. Sorry about that. But they go to get another Grist, which I then have to surgically extract for 2 life. I could have paid the 1 with the black, but I did want to hold up Dress Down just in case something weird happened. I do go for the surgical extraction on the Grist. I know there's only 1 left in deck realistically, but I just can't let them have access to the ability with Soul Cauldron, and we do have the Tishana's Tidebinder to be able to deal with that next activation into the future. So it feels like the right play, and we will start to have more of a clock in the near future. In this case, like I said, I did want to just be able to kind of either hold up Dress Down for something relevant that might come, or just cycle it to get deeper into the deck, which is exactly what I do. I do feel like I need to continue to be aggressive, as they're not presenting that much of a clock, and we do have the ability to Bowmaster ping down the only creature that they have. So this allows us to make sure that by doing it now, we're not opening ourselves up to weird Agatha Soul Cauldron lines, and just get this creature off the board and force them to find more creatures off the top of their deck. So very important that we flash that in now, and they're just going to try and trim down our graveyard a bit so that future Murktides maybe aren't as big. Perfectly fine with me. Going to start going on the offensive. I mean, at this point we've got 5 damage per turn with Bowmaster and Tishana. Very happy with all of this. Really not concerned at this point. I will say one thing that I missed, unfortunately, because it went by too quickly, but on the Thoughtseize from earlier, I did find that their hand had a Yawgmoth in it. but they also had a tap land in that Blooming Marsh. Couldn't have it come in untapped. So I knew that I was able to start applying some pressure and not have to worry too much about the Yawgmoth, as they weren't going to be able to cast it anytime soon. And even if they did, with an Orcish Bowmaster, 2 Orcish Bowmasters available to me, I knew that things were going to generally be in my favor. In this instance, last turn they don't cast the known Yawgmoth at this point, and they only have one other card in hand. The fact that they're not casting the Yawgmoth with the current board state shows me that they probably drew, almost certainly drew, an Endurance. I mean, it's the only card that they could really have that's relevant here. And they kind of get a little bit greedy, and they choose not to cast it until attack steps, which I understand, but at the end of the day, it allowed me to draw a very relevant Drown in the Loch off the top of my deck, and it's going to be able to answer the Endurance that they cast here and just essentially win the game for me. Of course, they're not dead on board here, but they only have access to the Yawgmoth. They're at 1. There's just nothing that they can do. So very intense grind on this one. He just kept drawing extremely relevant spells, just all of the stuff that is terrible for me, or us really. But you stick in there, you kind of try not to get too tilted about it and focus on how you find the right lines out of it, and just take the best approach to increasing your percentages to win the match. And in this case, we still very much get there. So very good match, very fun match, which sometimes is more difficult to say when it comes to playing against Yawgmoth. But I think a lot of fun here and a lot to be, maybe not a lot, but a good amount to be learned. So hopefully that was a super insightful game for you guys. And I'll just also add that as much as I'm trying to keep things concise, I do want to also expand on certain reasonings or certain lines that I take, because the dedication that I'm trying to put into this channel is really about explaining why I do things and the lines that I'm taking based off of what's in front of me, right? So if I just power through and kind of rush through as much as possible, you guys might not get as much value out of it as I'm hoping you will. But nonetheless, if you feel like maybe I'm still taking too long on certain things, let me know. Always open to feedback, and I'll try and find a balance between the two. But let's move on to our next match. Okay, welcome back for match number 4. Going to be on the draw here. Not the best hand. I mean, it could go well if it's a matchup where turn 5, 6, 7 is super relevant. But against something like a turn 1 Ragavan or a lot of pretty strong openers that most modern decks are capable of, this just isn't that great of an opening hand, and I'm going to throw it back hoping for a better 6. In this case, I do find that. I'm going to throw back the Tishana's Tidebinder here on the draw. While it's a strong card and the floor of being able to stifle a fetch land is great, doing so on my turn 3 when my opponent's already had a turn 3, just not that great, especially if we don't know what we're up against. So hoping to find some more relevant cards with the Consider. Again, we can shuffle it back, hopefully somewhere to the top, if things go that way. But this is a pretty quick game. They play a turn 1 Ragavan. Very glad I did not keep that first hand. And then I just full punt here. I forget that they have 3 mana available to them after this. I fetch, and they show me a Tishana's Tidebinder. Just really bad play, especially for someone who has advocated so strongly for Tishana's Tidebinder since the moment it was previewed. Pretty embarrassing, but again, brain farts happen, and I am a human, so it's gonna happen. No big deal. Can't get too tilted about it. Move on and try and win the next 2. Just as a final thing, they did show us a Hallowed Fountain, which was a bit surprising to me. I was just under the assumption that they were going to be UR Murktide, but clearly there's some kind of Jeskai deck. Not exactly sure what to expect. Maybe Jeskai Breach, but we'll try and figure out a sideboard plan accordingly, and hope that the next 2 games go well. All right, here we are for game number 2. Hopefully this is going to go a lot better than the first one. Opening hand on the play, pretty good for the assumed matchup of some type of Ragavan, Jeskai deck. Not exactly sure what we're up against, but generally should be a pretty good one. Orcish Bowmasters can make them struggle through some card draw, have Dismember for a turn 1 Ragavan, Drown in the Loch, Stubborn Denials for some stack interaction, Preordained to get deeper into the deck. Really tough hand to throw away if you wanted to, honestly, in the current matchup under the assumptions. So going to move forward with this and see how it goes. Going to lead on a Preordain here, which in this case is going to find a Shadow and a counterspell. Given the counterspells that I have in my hand, I decide to bottom the counterspell and top the Shadow, as we're definitely going to need a bigger threat than the Orcish Bowmaster that's currently in our hands. So hopefully we can find another land and just more gas from here. Opponent is going to lead on a Ragavan. Surprise, surprise. Very strong turn one play for most of these type of decks. Bowmaster in this case is definitely the best option here with them tapped out, and we can save that Dismember for the future. Opponent is just going to put out another Ragavan, more Ragavans. I love Ragavans so much. Just kidding, can't stand that card. Surprising here that my opponent just fetches out a Triome to kind of show me that they're going completely down, no counter spells. And in that case, I do want to take advantage to Thoughtseize them and try and figure out A, what I'm up against, but also B, how to game plan from here. I do Thoughtseize, and unfortunately I clicked through a little bit too quickly, but all I see is a Path to Exile and a bunch of lands. So not a great hand from my opponent, and going to be able to more than likely do some pretty significant damage over the coming turns. In this case, I do want to dismember the Ragavan and then only swing in with the Orcish Bowmaster in case they do draw another one, and then try and dash it. So want to have some protection there while getting the other Ragavan off the board and allowing myself to start putting out a Death Shadow that would be out of range of pretty much most of the removal that they would have, of course, other than Path to Exile, which I hope they don't have too many of. I'm going to get in with both creatures in this case now that I have another Bowmaster to protect me and can throw out the Death Shadow with an activated Ferocious Stubborn Denial or a Drown in the Loch. Opponent's going to continue to just push out the lands that I knew about, and I am going to continue to try and just push through on the offensive here. They're not overly being aggressive, I guess. In this case, they choose to end step Snapcaster Mage with the hope that they can get a Path to Exile through. Definitely not going to be letting that happen. And I will throw up a Drown in the Loch here. And the reason I choose to Drown in the Loch is basically just because I want to have access to really kind of just Stubborn Denial for anything moving forward. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, not much to think about there. They continue to play out lands that I know of and hold up their Snapcaster Mage. I draw another Death Shadow, and for me, it's really just trying to push through the last bit of damage. I've got a Stubborn Denial to hopefully protect myself from maybe another Path to Exile or something weird like that. So I'd rather just try and get the Snapcaster Mage off the board as a blocker, and see where this can go. They go for the Subtlety, which for me is just fine. I mean, it can present a bit of a problem moving forward, but I'll just pop the Bowmaster that I have and continue to press on, of course, still wanting to be aggressive. In this case, I do swing out with the Death Shadow and the token, hoping that they might just kind of make some bad blocks. The token really not representing much here, so I'm okay to lose it. It's not the end of the world. And of course, my opponent doesn't choose to trade the both of their creatures for what I have, so it doesn't work out exactly how I maybe thought my opponent might try and play it. But I wanted to just get a sense of their play style and how they would handle the situation. Realistically, still generally feeling good about the situation. They play out the final land that I knew about, so they've just got 2 unknown cards in hand at this point. I don't want to consider in my end step because realistically that opens me up to a Path to Exile or really any combination of unfortunate things that I tap out for. So I draw the Bowmaster that I'm aware of on the top of my deck, and they actually swing in with the Subtlety in the last turn, which to me represents that they, of course, have some type of answer for this Death Shadow, something to deal with it. They're feeling pretty good about being aggressive. They need to close this game out. I swing in exclusively with the Death Shadow under the assumption that they have another Subtlety, and I don't want to be casting anything before attack phases, so that Subtlety would be a lot more valuable to them. In this case, turns out they have an Otawara, so they're just going to bounce my shadow back. I'm going to play both of my shadows out and hold up my Stubborn Denial. They don't go for the attack here with the Subtlety, which means, of course, they don't have that much going on. They only have 1 card left in hand, so they have to go to blocks. In this case, they're basically dead on board if they don't have an answer to one of my shadows. I'm still under the assumption they might have a subtlety given the way that they've played this, so I do not want to be pushing out an Orcish Bowmaster or really any creatures that would give them additional value with the subtlety that I'm assuming they have in hand. And of course, they do have another subtlety, which forces them to go to blocks. They have to double block, which gives me basically the win here at this point. I don't think there's much that they can draw, and they scoop it up. So overall, pretty good win. They definitely had an opportunity to grind it out and sneak a win in. Bolt, snap, bolt, I assume is something they can do. So need to be generally cautious with the life totals. Can't get too crazy, especially when they've got some flyers that we might not be able to deal with. Should be an interesting match 3 from here.
Welcome back for game number 3. The sideboard's going to be unchanged, and this opening hand is fantastic. Definitely very good against a deck that's kind of mid-range Regovan style. Fatal Push to answer a turn 1 Regovan if they have it, a Bowmaster to force some interaction, multiple looks at a second land, and Murktide can come down as likely a 5/5, potentially even higher, with potentially a Stubborn Denial to back it up if we find 2 other lands. So definitely just a strong hand. Going to run it and see how it goes. So we'll see that opponent gonna start off strong again, lead on a Ragavan. Luckily, that won't be long for this world, given the fact that we've got a Fatal Push. Luckily, draw another fetch land, so we've got 2 lands. Opponent is just gonna send it back to us here. We fetch and step for an island to be able to play around Tidebinder. No need to go out and get a shock land and lower our life total too aggressively against a deck that's probably running 4 bolts. Just super dangerous to do. We don't have a Death Shadow in hand. It's just not a smart play, in my opinion. So in their end step here, going to consider for hopefully a 3rd land. Not going to find it. Counterspell I want to keep just because it's a good spell to have. Tishana Sidebinder goes to the bottom, and then we draw the Watery Grave off the top. So digging 1 deeper gets us there. Going to hold up Orcish Bowmasters and Stubborn Denial. Opponent is going to just fetch the tap land and continue to drop lands and send it back to me. I'm not going to play with the Bowmaster here, just not really necessary. In this case, I am fetching and shocking before I cast my Preordain. I want to make sure that my if I do find something, the 2 cards that I like on top, the second card is going to be there for me to draw in my next turn. So fetching and shocking at this point in the game, getting down to 11 life is also kind of relevant. If we do find a shadow, it can start to be played, and we're not, again, lowering our life total so much that it's too much of a concern against a bolt deck. Dismember, Bowmaster both going to the bottom, and we do hit the shadow that we were looking for, so that's exceptional. Orcish Bowmaster is going to kind of be held up, hoping to maybe have them cast a Preordain that we can throw the Bowmaster in front of. They just say draw, go, send it back to us. Draw a Stubborn Denial, pretty good for the future, but for now it's just a card that's going to sit in our hand. In this case here, they are going to cast a Preordain. I throw out the Bowmaster, expecting it to get countered, which it doesn't. Not really sure what that means about their hand. Probably just a bunch of interaction for creatures that are on the board. Their Preordain is going to top both. We do get the trigger, which is nice. So we've got a 2/2 Orc Army token, and they are going to Prismatic Ending the Bowmaster. In this case, I'm not going to try and fight over it. I do not want them resolving a potential Teferi. Mid-range Ragavan deck like this in Jeskai colors almost certainly going to have a Teferi in it somewhere, so do not want to be losing to a Teferi just because I want to protect an Orcish Bowmaster that's, at this point, in my opinion, kind of done its job. So we'll see how things progress from here. Spell Pierce, that's a good draw. Really can't complain about that. 1 mana spells to be able to answer what's going on their side of the field. Definitely going to be beneficial. Going to play at the Murktide Regent. I've got multiple Stubborn Denials. It feels kind of safe to do so. Get the Stubborn Denial, their first path to exile, going to their turn. While I only have 1 mana up, they try to path the Murktide again. In this case, I get to stub it again, but they are going to tap out for an Archmage's Charm to counter my Stubborn Denial. Not the end of the world, and in this case, the island actually allows us to hold up multiple forms of interaction and get a Death Shadow down. So not concerned with throwing the Death Shadow out as a 2/2. Against a deck like this, they only have 2 cards in hand. So multiple forms of interaction. They just basically can't have 3 perfect cards. Considering to find a fetch land to lower my life total enough to start swinging in with the Death Shadow and putting the pressure that I need, they cast a Snapcaster Mage. Because I have the Stubborn Denial and I know that their really only card that they can go for here is Archmage's Charm, I am going to allow the Snapcaster Mage to resolve. and essentially hold up the Stubborn Denial for the Archmage's Charm instead of countering the Snapcaster Mages. If they want to try and attack in, I'm going to hold back this Orc Army token. Just generally feeling good about everything at this point. They do have a Spell Pierce here. Technically, I could have thrown a spell at it, but there's no need to because I just have the mana to pay for it. So better to keep those spells in hand. They ship it back to me here, and at this point, this game's essentially over. Just going to swing in with both creatures because it forces them to block. Stubborn Denial. Yeah, this game's going to be over. So pretty happy with the win here. From going to basically just losing to a complete punt of fetching into a Tishana's Tidebinder in game one, and not allowing myself to get too put off by the misplay and just focusing on winning the next 2 games. Very happy with how this match turned out. See how the rest of the league goes. Welcome back for match number 5. We'll be on the play here. Opening hand is overall pretty good, although it does come with the problem that I've been noticing with Preordain, which is basically there are some times where you preordain on the play, turn 1 in the blind, and you don't exactly know what you're looking for. Obviously, you're looking to try and build a hand that you think is going to be efficient. Usually in this case, it's going to be another big creature or something like that. But maybe your opponent plays a turn 1 creature that's extremely important for them, and not having been able to just hold up your Fatal Push in turn 1 instead and really stay mana efficient for the rest of the game, because you have to tap out, in your second turn to Fatal Push that creature. Not super ideal, so I have made some changes just to try and test out some more instant speed focused main board options. So really just kind of sticking to Street Wraiths and Considers, which kind of eliminates some of that problem. In this case, I don't think it ends up being too much of a problem, but it is just an observation that I've made, so wanted to point it out. So we're on the play. We'll see how this plays out. I am going to Preordain, leading on a shock. Not really going to need to worry too much about my life total on the in the blind. Want to be able to get a shadow as soon as possible, and as long as my opponent isn't burned, no real issues. Preordain is going to find a Tidebinder and a Stub. The Tidebinder I want to keep on top. Just at this point, I know I have 3 mana, so I know it's going to be on curve and probably going to be a pretty good card. The Stubborn Denial, I don't have a creature big enough to be able to really enable it as effectively as I'd want to, so I just bought him at trying to find something more relevant. Go to their turn, we see we're against Hammer, so all they play out is a Sigarda's Aid, probably a pretty medium Hammer hand at this point. And we're going to draw a Consider, just going to hold up an Orcish Bowmaster if we need it. We've got multiple Fatal Pushes. They're going to play out an Urza Saga, so we can start to build a game plan out here. Consider in their end step, going to find a Preordain, which I want to keep. And from here, it's really all about being able to build an effective game plan for what they're likely going to be doing. Urza Saga with the Sigarda's Aid likely indicates that they're probably going to just try and activate the Saga a couple of times and put a hammer on some tokens. In this case, they don't have any other artifacts, so we know that their first construct is likely going to be a 1/1 token, which we can then ping down with the Bowmaster, so long as they don't have a 0 mana artifact to drop like an Ornithopter. And even if they do, we've got a Fatal Push to push that. So realistically, we should be able to kind of take our time here, make sure we use the Orcish Bowmaster as effectively as possible, and really take advantage of the presumed game plan that the opponent is on. So yeah, Preordain going to get this Consider here just in case. Likely not going to be doing anything really from our opponent, so we want to be able to just dig a little bit deeper into the deck. Consider is going to find a Watery Grave, which definitely want to be having. Shock in a the Watery Grave, so that we can hopefully get this shadow down soon. They are going to go for the construct that we figured they would, pinging it down with the Orcish Bowmaster, which is fantastic. Going to their turn, they choose not to make a construct token and instead go for a Gingerbrute, going with a Colossus Hammer, of course, on the search, which is fine. They then make the Gingerbrute unblockable. Really happy to just take 11 here, given that I have a Death Shadow, but they are going to play out a second Colossus Hammer, so at this point, need to be able to Fatal Push the Gingerbrute, go for the push. They then have the Surge of Salvation, so we have to double push. So far, everything has been played pretty well. assuming everything that our opponent is going to be doing. Thoughtseize is a great draw. Lets us see that they just really have a Pure Steel Paladin and a Cauldron Complete. So take the Pure Steel Paladin, kind of leave them with basically nothing but the Urza Saga to do pretty much all of the work for them. Go back to their turn again, and they play out an Esper Sentinel, which we are going to counterspell, more so just an annoyance than anything else. We've got a Tishana's Tidebinder to be able to stop the search activation, or really kind of anything that they kind of try to go to do with the Urza Saga. I think in this case, I am going to just stop the search and let them have the 3/3 token, just given the size of my Death Shadow. See how this plays out. Yeah, do stop the search here. So they've got 2 4/4 tokens, and I've got, a pretty decent board to not have to stress too much about it, knowing that they still have a Cauldron Complete in their hand. Swing in for 5. No need to use the Bitter Triumph here. This is actually pretty interesting by my opponent. They choose to put 2 Colossus Hammers, or a Colossus Hammer on each construct, and swing in. And this actually just leaves them completely dead to the Bitter Triumph that I've drawn. Being able to pay the 3 life or get rid of this Pure Steel Paladin, go to blocks, and essentially the game's going to be over. So a bit aggressive by the opponent here. I don't know. I don't want to say a misplay by them, but definitely pretty aggressive. So able to take advantage with a good draw and just staying patient, attacking when needing to, and really begin using that Orcish Bowmaster to its full effect. Way back when we knew what their essential game plan was going to be based off the cards they were playing out. So super happy with how that first game played out, and we'll see how game number 2 goes.
I'm going to take a look at some sideboarding here. Taking out 2 Preordain, 2 Stubborn Denial, 1 Counterspell, 1 Bowmaster, 1 Dismember, 1 Drown in the Loch. Bringing in 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Engineered Explosives, 2 Surgical Extractions, 1 Dress Down, and a Stern Scolding. In hindsight, I probably should have actually brought in a second Stern Scolding and just reduced it to 1 Surgical Extraction coming in. Surgical Extraction can be good at hitting a hammer or something super relevant that's a little bit more combo-y in the deck. And Stern Scolding is going to be able to, on the draw, be able to counter a Sanctifier and Vec, or really most of their creatures, but most important in post-game boards is really going to be your Sanctifier and Vex. Is not a whole lot of ways to deal with it once it hits the board. So super important that you have ways to answer that early on. Taking a look at the opening hand here, pretty good. It's got multiple Fatal Pushes, Counterspell, potential for a Death Shadow on turn 3 if we hit another Shocker Fetch land, Tishana's to be able to interact with either Urza Sagas or some triggers of some sort. So pretty happy with this hand, but as you will see, this game's going to play out a little strange, and we'll start to run it and kind of get a sense of why that is. Opponent leads on a Pithing Needle here, naming Polluted Delta. Those are the 2 lands in hand that I have. Definitely problematic. Pretty wild that that's just the lead, especially when I think they didn't even mulligan from what I can see. So this actually leads me to believe that they probably have multiple Pithing Needles in the deck, potentially even 3 at this point. Like, I'm not giving it too much consideration, but for future knowledge, I do have to be thinking about the odds of a Pithing Needle being in someone's opening hand and being what they lead on in a spot like this. So one other thing to consider here is the fact that they name Polluted Delta and how much it screws me over. The construction of the deck is part of the reason why this happens. In reality, because I'm not playing a swamp and needing to fetch a black land is not something I care about. It's actually better to build the deck in a way that Polluted Delta is probably just a 2 of in the deck, maybe even a 1 of, just because you don't want to run into this scenario where it is the card, or at least the land in your deck, your fetch land, that you run into the most, because you can come into this scenario. Mind you, it's very, very unlikely, but when it does happen, it can screw you over pretty big time. And not saying I would have won this game had I not had this scenario play out, because my opponent's going to have, as we see, a Sanctifier and Vec, and then it's just going to have nothing but gas from here. Nonetheless, it's just better to construct the deck if you're exclusively playing islands as your basics, in a way that you distribute the fetch lands in a meaningful way, so that they aren't above 3 of a particular fetch. so that you can distribute that risk a little bit more evenly. Anyway, that's the game. As you can see, not much I could do here, and we just have to go to game 3. Welcome back for our final match of the league. Going for the 4-1 here up against Hammer. Opening hand, generally feeling good about. I'll get into that in a second. I did make one slight adjustment in the sideboard. As discussed, I wanted to bring in that other Stern Scolding. In this case, I did actually drop the Preordain, similar to what I was talking about in I think it was the last match. Preordain and Fatal Push in situations like this can start to play against one another, especially in decks that are playing low to the ground creatures like Hammer is, where you want to be able to interact on their turn 1 to get that creature off the board when they don't have some type of protection up or something going on that's going to be much more meaningful. So you do not want to be preordaining on your turn 1. If anything, the later game it can be a good draw, but you don't really want to have it in your opening hand. So reducing the amount of them can be quite helpful. So that's the only change that we make there. Jumping into the hand itself, I mean, we've got a Fatal Push for anything on turn 1. We've got an Orcish Bowmaster, some stack interaction, a Counterspell, which can notably, at least the fact that we're on the play, allow us to counter a Sanctifier and Vec. Spell Pierce might even be able to hit, something like a Sigarda's 8 on turn 1. So quite a few options here. Very happy with the opening hand, and we'll see how this game plays out. Buckle up. It's going to be a doozy. This one plays out pretty interestingly, especially as we get towards the back half of the game. So for me, going to lead on the Flooded Strand here, just to avoid any weird Pithing Needle shenanigans. It'd be pretty wild if they name Flooded Strand just in the blind, but we do see another turn 1 Pithing Needle from them. At this point, like I said in the last game, I mean, I already had it somewhat in the back of my mind that they're probably looking to, or they probably have multiple Pithing Needles in the deck. And the fact that they've gone and led on Pithing Needle turn 1 again in the same scenario, no mulligans, just Pithing Needle in the opening hand. It's the lead play. I really have to think that there's probably 3 of them in the deck at this point, maybe even 4. So going to have to keep that in mind when they're looking for Urza Saga searches, stuff like that. Just keep it top of mind. But yeah, they're going to play out this Urza Saga. They're going to play a Strict Proctor here. In case you haven't seen Strict Proctor, I'll just see if I can pull it up here. Yeah, it's a flying 1/3 that whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to counter that ability unless its controller pays 2. Kind of a weird card to bring in this matchup. I mean, I don't really have anything that affect. I don't know if they just have a weird read on what my deck is. They don't realize it's a Death Shadow deck. I'm not really sure, but this is going to actually screw them up a lot more than it screws me up, because all of their equipment entering the battlefield is going to force them to have to pay to. Nonetheless, I do want to try and keep creatures off the battlefield, so I do counter it here, and just see how things are going to play out. That Preordain is going to find an Engineered Explosives and a Death Shadow. Want to keep both of those on top. Engineered Explosives obviously being a very good card to have against a board full of Urza Saga tokens. We are going to ping down this first token that they put out, drawing the Engineered Explosives that we knew about and starting to apply a bit of pressure. Trying to find a fetch land there so we can play out the Death Shadow. Unfortunately, just find another Shadow, which is good pressure. They do have the second Pithing Needle in this case. So naming the One Ring, this indicates that the Strict Proctor play means that they probably thought we were on some type of different deck that was One Ring related, UB control or something like that. So already 2 Pithing Needles down. Then we're playing a Warden of the Inner Skies, another card that if you basically only play Modern like I do, never seen this. I guess it's a new card, so really not sure about this one, but it's a 1/2 1-drop that as long as Warden of the Inner Skies has 3 or more counters on it, it is flying in Vigilance, and then you can tap 3 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control to put a +1/+1 counter on Warden of the Inner Sky, scry 1, and you can only activate that ability as a sorcery. So quite a bit of text. The flying is a bit of a pain, especially if I don't have a Murktide available to me, so I do want to get this thing off the board, as I don't want to get into a situation where we're getting beat down by just a flyer, or they're able to put a hammer on it or something like that once it is flying. So I'm going to let that hit the battlefield. But of course, well, not that I had an option, I guess, but yeah, Fatal Push that as soon as possible. Unfortunate to kind of draw a non-shock, non-fetch land here, but not the end of the world. They're going to go to make another token, this time not getting a Pithing Needle. So potentially out of Pithing Needles at this point, as naming Engineered Explosives for them probably makes the most sense. They don't have a hammer, so that's great, because otherwise I was just dead there. They choose not to attack, which is the right play by them. I guess at this point they've figured out that I'm a shadow deck. So we've got 2 shadows that get stranded in hand. Surgical Extraction, not a whole lot of great calls to be taking here. I guess Pithing Needle could be the option, just given that I assume that they probably have more, and the Engineered Explosive that I have could do some pretty significant work. I do play out the EE here. I think, honestly, looking back at this in hindsight, it made the most sense to surgically extract the Pithing Needle just to be 100% safe that they were all gone and getting 2 Death Shadows out while having my Engineered Explosives on 0. I think that would have been definitely the best play here, but not the option that I choose to take. Instead, I just kind of force them to not do much. Drawing the Fatal Push, quite nice for some backup into the future. They make another construct and go to, I believe, yeah, I'm going to blow it up here under the assumption that they do have the option to search up a 3rd Pithing Needle. Again, in hindsight, I really think probably surgically extracting the needle 2 turns ago was really the right play, and getting 2 Death Shadows down with some pressure could have helped shore up quite a bit of what ends up playing out here. They do make another construct token after I blow it up. They do find a 3rd Pithing Needle, so at this point, they are Pithing Needle deck, I guess. Still unable to get the Death Shadows out. I believe this is a game that's quite removed for me at this point. I believe I'm holding a surgical extraction for something like a hammer, especially now that I have a counter spell available to me, trying to just shut down some of the more combo focused plays that they can take. And close the game out. They are going to have a Sanctifier Invec here, which I counter. Unfortunately, they have a backup Sanctifier Invec, and things are not looking super great. Again, well, sorry, I shouldn't say again in this case. Basically, not having an opportunity to have priority to surgical the Sanctifier Invec is kind of an unfortunate consequence of that. I guess those plays there. Much as that was exactly what I was intending to do after I countered it, they get priority and of course are able to cast the second Sanctifier effect that they have, Sanctifier effect that they have in their hand. So very unfortunate that that's the way that it plays out. Again, probably should have took the Pithing Needle a while back, but it is what it is. And then just to show the hand that they have is Pure Steel Paladin, Colossus Hammer, Sigarda's Aid. So things are looking very bleak at this point. But what can you do? It is what it is. Shadow is going to go into the graveyard, and we're able to shock in a Watery Grave to finally get our Death Shadows down. This is pretty funny. I've got 1 card in hand. I tap 2 mana after they cast the Colossus Hammer, basically kind of in frustration, but more so to some degree a bit of a bluff, like I had Dress Down. And you're going to see from here, the opponent actually believes it. They don't attack, they just hold back because I guess, I don't know exactly why they do what they're doing. I mean, I still think if I had it, you're supposed to attack here. I'm not losing. Well, no, I guess I could have blocked with a shadow, 13/13 shadow. They lose the token. Yeah, no, I mean, if I did have it, it does kind of make sense to hold. So at this point, continuing to keep 1 card in hand, they're not doing anything, I guess, at the threat of a potential Dress Down to completely destroy their board. The fact that they're keeping the Colossus Hammer on the construct definitely signals to me that they think I have a Dress Down, as Dress Down would no longer kill the construct token if I were to play it out. So got very lucky. Definitely a spot where sometimes just trying to play a bluff that makes sense can work out in your favor. We're just going to go back and forth here for several turns. They play another Pure Steel Paladin. I've got my Orcish Bowmaster, which is going to be a great card to have. Unfortunately, his Engineered Explosives is turned off with the 3rd Pithing Needle. And yeah, Strict Proctor. So there's another Strict Proctor, as I said earlier, that is going to be problematic more so for them than it is for me, right? So all of their equipment triggers they have to pay for. We're starting to get into a spot where multiple Orcish Bowmasters potentially triggering off Pure Steel Paladin draws, really just going to be a spot where I can start to ping down multiple creatures potentially, or at least one creature for sure. Just trying to find the dress down that we've been bluffing the whole time. We've got 3 of them in the deck, and there we go. Consider is able to find us that. So we need to just pick our spot to try and find a way to play this out that's going to allow us to win the match, really. Fatal Push is going to be great for taking out the construct, and then depending on if they choose to draw or not, we've got Bowmaster triggers to ping down Pure Steel Paladins. We've got a 3rd Shadow, which is a great draw at this point. We've got a pretty big board state once we're able to remove some of the key pieces that they have up. So just really need to stay patient, pick my time, and figure it out. They've managed to play an Urza Saga here, and with the draw of a 2nd Fatal Push, I've decided that now is kind of my do or die moment. They go to play the Shadow Spear, and this is going to trigger a multitude of different things. In paper, I feel like this would be kind of a bit of a pain to keep track of and pay attention to, but obviously MTGO does a nice job of tracking it all for you. Strict Proctor, they are going to pay in this case for one of the draw activations. And then, yeah, I guess they have to pay. Yeah, I don't exactly remember what's going on here. They're paying for stuff. They're drawing cards. They go to play a hammer. They can't actually have it equip over to the creature because of the Strict Proctor. So yeah, they're definitely screwing themselves more than anything else. I'm able to ping down their Pure Steel Paladin. I'm able to push some stuff, get it all out of the way, go for a lethal attack, and then finally dress down for the win. Truly just an astonishing game that I feel like I had no business winning. I mean, I think if I would have surgically extracted the pithing needle earlier, like I was talking about, maybe that game becomes a little bit easier because I do end up having access to that engineered explosives, the 2nd engineered explosives to wipe out a lot of the 1-drops. The engineered explosives that I had on 0 doesn't really get threatened by anything after that. I can just hold it up indefinitely. That's probably the better play, but nonetheless, being able to bluff out a dress down as your final card, having your opponent believe it, and then getting to a point where you can actually draw your bluff card and find a spot to somehow get the win. Truly just one of the more enjoyable games that I've played in quite a while. So very happy to get the 4-1. Obviously, the humans matchup at the very start was disappointing to watch back, especially how poorly I played it. But definitely feel like the deck can run some pretty solid games, and I've been testing a couple of different versions. Slight adjustments to sideboards, as I said, trying to get into a spot where I play kind of an all, as much as possible instant speed version of the deck. So taking out the preordains, bringing in exclusively considers and street wraiths as your kind of filtering method of drawing deeper into the deck, and being able to hold up fatal pushes on turn 1 more consistently. Anyway, that's the league. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Definitely want to hear some feedback around what you liked, what you didn't like. Definitely want to try and make these videos as suitable to what you guys are looking for as possible, right? I started recording this stuff and kind of speaking through it just to try and help get people that are just picking either the deck up for the first time or still newer to the deck, and really make some content that would allow them to learn the deck as efficiently as possible. Not to say everything I do is going to be exceptional, as we saw with the humans matchup, but the purpose is for, of course, myself to go back and see some of my own matchups and get a better sense of how I'm playing those, but also to help kind of talk through some of the decisions that I make, whether they be good or bad, and the implications that they can have across the scope of a game or a match. And hopefully, yeah, just get you guys playing Death Shadow, specifically Dimir Death Shadow, in a much more effective way.